Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannic, and today we're exploring the importance of taking individual action to change the world. And our guest is Janet O-Shea. And before we get into our conversation, I wanted to preface this topic with a story. I want to tell you a story of something that I experienced recently that relates. So, I think most of you know that I moved from Sonoma County, California, where I was most of my adult life, like for 30 years. And I now live in Eugene, Oregon. And I was recently asked to be on a Q&A panel here in Oregon after a showing of the film Eating Our Way to Extinction, which I would say is one of the best documentaries that we have about the environmental connection to animal ag. It was a really good movie, a good film. So we're watching this film, like 90 minutes of laying out exactly why we should be vegan. And then the Q&A comes, so we go up on stage and the host asked us on the panel to introduce ourselves and say a little something about the film, and then we were going to take questions from the audience. So I give my intro and say it was an awesome film, yada, yada. And then the mic gets passed to one of my fellow panelists. And he was the head of the local Eugene 350.org group. Now, 350.org is an environmental group primarily focused on climate disruption. And this guy proceeded to use his introduction time to talk about how he agreed with the science of the film, but not the ask or the action that it said to take. And he basically said that it does no good to go vegan and that rather everyone should be getting involved with legislative work, improvements like the Farm Bill, etc., the stuff that 350.org is doing. And this totally threw me. I had no idea that he was going to say that. And I was kind of like, who invited him? But this was not a vegan group that was showing the film. It was a more broad coalition political group. And it's great that they showed this film, but they had invited this guy who had a very different message than the film. And I felt like I had to respond. I did the best I could countering his narrative without being prepared for it at all, trying not to argue or be confrontational to a fellow panelist. I had no idea that this is what I was stepping into or what I'd be responding to. But my main point that I kept trying to come back to, even with questions from the audience that didn't have anything to do with it, I kept feeling like I was trying to circle back to this point because it was, very important because this guy kept countering going vegan, right? But my main point was, why not both? We need both. Yes, we need to do the legislative work, of course. But how is encouraging vegan hurting that? Right? I think it supports and strengthens that work. It's all connected. We need to do everything. We need every effective tool in the toolbox, and individual personal change is effective. It empowers us to do more. It supports the systematic change by eroding the pillars of support in the marketplace and creates that foundational support, that public support, so the structural change can happen. Anyway, I was I was so disheartened that this narrative was out there in Eugene, very liberal Eugene. So even more important to do the work and do the work that I'm doing here locally with the Eugene Vegan Fest. So this is our topic for the day because this narrative is out there. And I'm concerned that people are hearing this more and more. It's just another excuse, another barrier to living vegan, especially with low-hanging fruit like environmentally minded people. And actually more and more it's coming from within our own animal advocacy movement, the same message. And I've talked about this kind of a parallel train of thought with my solo episode called The Cage-Free Conundrum, that if you follow the money, you follow the movement's resources, jobs in the animal advocacy movement, it's all now shifting primarily to the inside game, to welfare campaigns and corporate campaigns and ballot initiatives, getting the government and the corporations to make changes and taking the resources away from direct individual grassroots vegan outreach. And not just diverting resources, but actually spreading rhetoric that grassroots efforts are ineffective. So, this is what we're going to get into today. This is what we're going to talk about in our upcoming interview. So, let's jump into this really important topic. I think you're going to really find this interesting. Okay, so today on the podcast, we have Janet O-Shea, informally known as Jay. She's the author of several books, book chapters, and articles on veganism, animal rights, and environmentalism. She's part of the teaching team for the freshman cluster course, Food as a Lens for the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA, and on the advisory board of Climate Diet, and is also a board member of New Roots Institute. Janet is a professor and chair of the Department of World Arts and Cultures and Dance at UCLA. She is a regular volunteer with animal rights, broader solidarity, and food justice organizations. Welcome to the podcast, Jay.
Thank you, Hope. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
I am too, because, I discovered you from an article that you co-wrote, and we're going to talk more about that later. But I found that we had a lot of parallels with our interests and things that we do. So we have a lot to talk about. But we like to start by getting to know you with the question, why and when did you go vegan?
It's actually a long and convoluted story, but I think it might be worth telling some of it because I think the transition to veganism often is convoluted. And I think my story might be illustrative. When I was a child, I never liked meat. I just had this implicit revulsion towards it.
Mm.
But I grew up in a working class Irish American household. There was not a lot of fresh produce. There was not a lot of cooking from scratch. So it was kind of hard to avoid meat. I went vegetarian as a teenager. And I have to say upfront and admittedly, I did so for fairly superficial reasons. I thought it was something alternative and countercultural and therefore interesting. But I've always liked to research. And so I started to delve into some of the interconnected issues about animal exploitation, about the environment. I was reading the magazine Vegetarian Times. This is in the 1980s.
Oh yeah, I remember Vegetarian Times. Yep.
Good old Vegetarian Times. And I had read about this thing called veganism. People weren't talking about it a lot, but basically all I understood was that it was a more committed form of vegetarianism. And so I was interested and I was kind of functionally vegan. I wasn't connected to animal rights communities at all. I was the only vegan I knew. So even though I was functionally vegan, I would say it didn't really fully connect for me. I then had these opportunities to travel in college and graduate school. I spent time in India doing research. I got to travel to the Philippines. And so I ended up veering out of veganism. I ate dairy when I was in India. I ate some fish when I was in the Philippines. And that came from wanting to be respectful of other people's cultures. It was pragmatic. But the result was that for several decades, I was kind of functionally vegetarian, veering towards pescatarian occasionally. And I wasn't fully happy with that decision. I always knew, in my heart of hearts, I always knew veganism was the goal. But I didn't fully grasp how complexly interconnected all of the issues around animals and human rights and the environment. I didn't really grasp how fully interconnected they were.
Mm.
Until in the early 2010s, my family and I took a road trip to Portland, driving through Northern California in the winter. And it was just devastating how dry the landscape was and how there was no snow in the mountains. And that just brought everything home. Or it's like, this is the environmental crisis. This is not an abstraction. And in Portland, I happened to go into a bookstore and find Jonathan Safran Foer's Eating Animals. And everything changed for me. And I went vegan right away. And that was in 2012.
Hmm. It's interesting that you were had such an aversion to meat as a child, and that's something that Kojin and I, my husband and I, call visceral veganism, where
Yeah.
people just kind of are just grossed out by meat, as we should be, because it's the flesh of an animal. So yeah, that's
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It's super interesting. I think like for some people there's this trauma of, oh no, chicken is a chicken, and like as a child they start crying. For me it was more visceral than that. I think that's a good
yeah.
description. It wasn't even the like, oh no, that's an animal. It was just like, this is gross. So,
Gross.
yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, veins and blood and ooh, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because I think some people who are not vegan are like, "Oh, that's squeamishness," um, but I think it was Melanie Joy in Carnism. She talks about how what we call squeamishness is really connected to compassion.
Yeah. Yeah. I
So,
mean, natural aversion that maybe, we should really think about, consider,
yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
deeply. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. Well, thank you for telling us about your journey. And so interesting that it did take you a few decades of being vegetarian. And I think this is common, especially for people that did it long ago. I mean, you started in the 80s with kind of dietary change and exploration. So yeah, it can be a journey, and it can take some time, and that's okay. As long as, like you said, veganism's the goal. I say, like, people are vegan in their heart and they're trying to get there, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what gets called failure outside the movement may not be failure. I think that's where it's illustrative.
Hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think sometimes when people look at veganism, it's a lot of, well, people try and they fail, but I don't know if it's trying and failing. Like failure, first of all, is a step on the road to accomplishment. But also, I think it's people trying to land in a system that makes it really difficult to live according to our values.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it's a process, and it's a process of having to step outside of what is mainstream, what is easy and accessible and all of that. So it can take time. Yeah. So, Jay, I invited you on the podcast because of your excellent opinion piece that you co authored and was posted online in Newsweek. And it was called "Even One Person's Food Choice Affects the Whole Planet." And as soon as I read this, I knew I wanted to connect with you. And then once we started emailing, I found out that you also give a presentation about Gandhi and the Satyagraha movement, and the connection, and the Khadi movement, and connecting that to individual grassroots action. And that is just so interesting to me. And I was like, I have to have you on the podcast. I love all of this. And we're going to get into Gandhi later. I do really want to talk about that. But I thought, let's start with the critique of educational outreach to foster individual change. Really, vegan education, right? Trying to get people to go vegan is what we're really talking about, but it can apply to other things. So, individual change versus systematic change. And of course, systematic change being more like government, legislation, ballot initiatives, corporate campaigns, corporate outreach, getting corporations to change. And there seems to be this kind of conflict, right? A seeming conflict in strategies for activism, and the environmental movement has this conflict, and now we're seeing it actually in our own animal advocacy movement, this individual outreach versus systematic outreach or systematic campaigning. So let's talk about that conflict first, that conflict of individual change versus systematic change. What is the tension there? And and why did you write this piece? Why did you feel it was important to talk about the importance of individual change?
Oh, great. That's a great question. So, we actually wrote this piece, the team of authors, we wrote this piece in response to another Newsweek op-ed. Newsweek said, well, we don't really do like riposte style op-eds. So write your own and we'll publish it. So we sort of embedded the op-ed that we were responding to. But the op-ed that we were responding to was really interesting because of the flaws in its reasoning. So the headline of that op-ed was, "Don't bother going vegan to save the planet. Do this instead."
Ah.
And the author, who happened to be doing, I think, an MBA in sustainable technologies, his advice was, don't go vegan. Instead, you should invest money into sustainable clean energy startups, which is pretty self-serving, right? But his argument for why you shouldn't go vegan, it was twofold. One, he started out literally in a paragraph, started out talking about veganism and then immediately switched to talking about recycling. And he was like, take recycling, for example. These are all the reasons why recycling is not effective. And then the other thing that was interesting and very illustrative is that he referenced meat. And we can go back to the question of like why veganism is not like recycling. But the other thing that was really indicative was that he used meat industry studies that supposedly show why going vegan is not effective as a climate mitigation strategy. And that part is fascinating because when you look at the actual studies he's referencing, there's a few embedded assumptions. And to my mind, those assumptions are completely wacky. So the meat industry models assume, first of all, that we would take all the food waste that is currently fed to animals who are then raised and slaughtered for food, that we would take all of that food waste and we would burn it, putting all that carbon into the atmosphere.
Like, do you mean if we all went vegan?
Yes.
What would we do with this excess food that we're feeding the animals? Is that what you're
Right.
Okay.
Right. So basically the food that like is the food waste from farms that doesn't get sent to market and perhaps things like food scraps. So they were like, what would we do with all of that? Well, we would just burn it. Which is just bonkers because of course you could use it for compost.
Yeah, for a lot of things, or
For a
just
lot of things.
not grow it in the first place.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And all of the food related climate mitigation models that I've seen, all of them do also address food waste. They also say that as part of this, we need to address food waste. But even if we didn't, we could just use it as compost directly. So the fact that they work that into the model and they work in all that those carbon emissions is really disingenuous.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that they do is they assume that because we've taken all that food waste and we've burnt it, we're going to have to use a whole bunch of industrial fertilizers to grow vegetables for human consumption.
Why?
Exactly. Right. Because we burned the food waste that we could have been using as compost. So that's really an erroneous assumption. And that's a meat industry tactic, is to keep coming back to this idea that only animal manure actually functions as fertilizer or possibly industrial fertilizer. And therefore, if you're not raising animals for food and slaughtering them, you must be using industrial fertilizer. And we know that that's absolutely not true. I mean, we know that there is such thing as veganic agriculture. If we wanted to, we could even take sanctuary animals and use their manure, but we don't need to. So that's erroneous.
Yeah.
I think your question, though, it was not so much what is the flaw in the reasoning. I think your question was, why did we write this op-ed?
Yeah.
And then what were some of the critiques of individual activism?
No, but that was all very interesting. I actually didn't realize that it was a response to another article. So I didn't know that that was the case. So go ahead and what was the premise, or what was the response in that it is important to go vegan?
Right. Okay. So one of our starting points was to take on this idea, this erroneous assumption that veganism is like recycling. And it's not. Veganism is not like recycling for some pretty important reasons. So recycling is a downstream effort. It is trying to clean up the mess after the fact. And in a way, it's a form of damage control. But veganism is an upstream effort. It's trying to cut off the problem at the source. and it's boycotting the products of a damaging industry. So it's trying to change a damaging system by applying economic pressure. And recycling doesn't put any economic pressure on a system of overproduction, overconsumption. It's basically bailing water out of a boat with holes in it. So,
Mm.
like, necessary, probably, but not terribly effective. So, if you were going to make a comparison, like the zero waste movement might be a more apt comparison, but even that doesn't really hold because the production of objects is an important environmental problem, but it's not comparable in degree to the other leading drivers of environmental degradation, like animal agriculture and transportation. So, veganism is a direct intervention. It's directly challenging one of the major drivers of environmental degradation. It's sort of disingenuous as well to only talk about climate change. And that's something we hear a lot from meat industry studies as well, is to turn the conversation to climate change and then to say, oh, well, the methane isn't actually that big of a deal because we can generate energy from it or because it will break down. And when they do that, first of all, again, they're rigging the numbers, but also they're not talking about all the other forms of environmental degradation in terms of land use, in terms of freshwater use, in terms of deforestation, ocean acidification. So it's a little bit of a bait and switch there as well.
Yeah. And
Oh
also
yeah, go ahead.
too, it's not only methane. Nitrous
Right.
oxide and other greenhouse gases are in high quantities from animal agriculture as well. So it's
Yes.
not only
Yes.
methane. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so there's been this response to the critique of, hey, let's not just talk about carbon dioxide. Then, as soon as methane came up as an issue, then it was, well, oh, let's only talk about methane. Right.
Mm,
And
mm.
that's another major problem with the meat industry studies that say, oh, you know, people going vegan is only going to reduce emissions by 1 to 2%. The other thing they don't talk about is land use and opportunity cost. So all of that land that's being used for grazing, so much of it is deforested. And if we really in this utopian situation where everybody in the US went vegan, we would be able to take all that land that's now not being used for grazing and raising crops for animals, and we could actually reforest it. So any kind of legitimate model really should include that as part of it. It should
Mm.
include the opportunity benefit of reforestation.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Rewilding, reforesting, replanting, it's so critical. I call it nature-based solutions, to
Yeah.
this crisis. We don't need all kinds of technological solutions. I mean, that'll help too. However, let's just replant and rewild. We have, a wonderful technology that nature gave us, green plants that absorb carbon, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where we have this nature-based, biologically based drawdown system.
Yeah.
We have a geoengineering system that we can use that it was actually helping to restore the ecosystem and
Yeah.
it'll restore biodiversity. So we don't need to get ahead of ourselves and start thinking about like what are we do we need to be thinking about these geoengineering systems that are going to cause damage in the short term but save us in the long term
Right.
when we actually have this possibility right in front of us for
Yeah. And how
rewilding.
does veganism help? Well, we're using tons of land to graze animals, to grow the feed that goes to feed the animals. We could eliminate so much acreage and rewild it.
Yeah, exactly.
Regrow all these acres that are going to animal agriculture. So, yeah, yeah. Uh, well, I want to pull us back into kind of the individual change versus systematic change issue that was very much part of this article you wrote. And as we go into this, something that I want to say is that, I don't understand why some of these organizations and individuals have to say no, don't do individual change, it won't help. Why change yourself? We should only focus on systematic change. why not both? I don't get why we can't do both. I mean, we are in a crisis, right? We need both. And grassroots tactics, individuals doing good things, whether it's zero waste or going vegan, that helps. It supports the systematic change. And another way that it's talked about sometimes in systems thinking is the inside game and the outside game, where the inside game is working with industry, the outside game is like individual identity change or culture change, and how we need both. In any movement you need both. And if you attempt systematic change without the popular democratic support, without the cultural change happening, then that change is going to be, how successful can it be, right? It's possibly going to be not as resilient. And if we try to make systems change in animal agriculture, but people still want their cheeseburgers, right? Well, how's that going to hold? It has to be both, right?
Absolutely. And I think we just saw that in recent US politics. This whole thing of they're coming for your cheeseburgers. So if we try to make systemic change without buy-in, I agree, it's bound to fail. I think the history of all this is fascinating
Yeah.
because the environmental movement and I think now the animal rights movement both are really pushing this individual actions don't matter
Yeah.
narrative.
Yeah.
I think it's really peculiar because for the longest time the efforts were actually only focused on individual action and environmental organizations were really focusing on individual actions, change your light bulbs, drive less. What's interesting here is that individual actions are not all the same. They're not all just actions that have a minuscule effect. So when environmental organizations were saying change out your light bulbs, or actually these meat industry studies, they very often say buy a hybrid. Well, it's interesting that none of them say give up your car. None of them say ride a bike. And then, by the way, lobby your town to get better bike lanes, right?
Mm.
So even when it comes to individual action, they're strategically picking the things that are going to have a small impact. So I think that's really important for us to remember that individual actions are not all the same. And this is less true of the animal rights movement, but the environmental movement really was urging very, very small individual change. So then when you look at that and you say individual change doesn't work, well, maybe you're looking at the wrong individual changes.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing is exactly what you've been saying, which is that that's a false dichotomy. So particularly in the environmental movement for a while there was individual change isn't action, it's a distraction. And the research now shows that it's a false binary to say we can change individual behavior or we can change the system. And in fact, more recent studies show that individual actions, just as you're saying, set the conditions for social change.
Yeah.
They prime us for societal transformation. They make it more appealing and more acceptable. So, to go back to this comparison to bicycling that I just invoked, a bike lane is a perfect example of this, that you can transform a city and put in a bunch of bike lanes, but if nobody's cycling, it's actually not going to be effective. And in fact,
Yeah.
it's going to be counterproductive because you're going to have a bunch of drivers who are angry about losing their parking.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have a whole community of people who are cycling and then you put in bike lanes, there are going to be a whole bunch of people who are supportive. And I think that's the same thing with individual veganism. If your workplace adopts a default veg policy and you're vegan, you're vegetarian, you're flexitarian, you're transitioning to one of those things, that's going to be really wonderful. If you've never even thought about these issues yourself, probably your response is going to be to grumble about it. Be like, well, why isn't there meat included?
Yeah.
Clearly there is a relationship there that individual change sets us up to make larger scale change more appealing. And really interesting set of studies that a lot of proponents of systemic change, it turns out, actually are doing far less on a personal level than people who are not as concerned with systemic change. So there was this book, the author is Arthur Brooks, who looked at a blood donation study, and it turns out that the people who argue for systemic change only end up giving blood at a rate of like 30% less. So if everybody adopted that idea that only systemic change matters, like these really basic, compassionate, altruistic gestures would actually take a dive. So I
Wow.
think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing that's super interesting is there was this article by Jennifer Jaquette. I hope I'm saying her name right, from the University of Miami, and another scholar named Loredana Loy. And they discovered that just at the same time that the fossil fuel industry was pushing individual action, albeit minor individual action, but the fossil fuel industry, it's true, BP invented the idea of the carbon footprint calculator, right? And they were encouraging people to take personal responsibility. At the very same time, the animal agriculture industry was obstructing campaigns focused on individual action. So they were obstructing even really minor things like Meatless Monday. The industry was getting right in there. And this was happening from the 80s with the Diet for a New America campaigns. That the meat industry got in there, they obstructed it, they obstructed cities that tried to adopt meatless policies, but they also really started pushing this narrative that individual dietary change is pointless, that animal agriculture isn't contributing that much to environmental crisis. And the result of it was that these campaigns scaled back their asks over time. So I think in the 80s, it was decrease your meat consumption by 50%. And then it went down to give up meat 1 day a week. So it's really clear from that yes, the idea of personal responsibility for environmental crisis comes from the industry, but the idea that individual action does nothing, that also comes from the industry. And
Hmm.
if the industry is pushing so hard back against individual action, that suggests, and this is actually in the Jaquette and Loy article, if the industry is pushing back so hard, it probably means that it is effective.
Yeah. Wow. Wow, some really interesting stuff there. And I think, yeah, what you were saying about the environmental industry just asking for, that not all asks are the same and, not all actions are equal. And I think we see that in the vegan movement, in the animal advocacy movement, where we're discouraged from actually asking for people to go vegan, live vegan. That's too big an ask. That's, let's reducitarian and all of that, and meat free Monday and all those things that are softer asks, right? But to me, I feel like, well, people that are interested in helping, people that want to do something, they're going to do what they can do. They're going to, work towards something. If our ask is vegan, then they're going to work towards that. Then they themselves can do some reducing. They themselves can do meat free Monday. They're going to make those steps towards. But if we don't have the end goal of vegan, of fully eliminating animal products, then they don't even know that that's where they're going, or that that's the best thing to do. I understand that, that people are going to have to take steps and progress like your journey, like we talked about in the beginning. But I think that it is important, though, to have our only ask, or our biggest ask, or our most important ask be live vegan. Because then, that's what people will work towards. And these other asks can just be along with the recipes and things that are supportive, right? I don't know.
I fully agree with what you're saying that if animal rights organizations can't step up and say, if we want to change this system, first of all, to say we want to change the system,
Yeah.
that in itself is an important statement. And one thing you can do is go vegan. If you can't even say it, then how do you achieve it, right? If you
Yeah.
can't even imagine something, how do you achieve it?
Yeah.
I know we'll talk about Gandhi and the Satyagraha
Oh
movement
yeah,
later.
we've got a lot to get
Yeah,
to. This is
yeah.
great though.
But there's this quote attributed to Gandhi, which is, "If you don't ask, you don't get." Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, I think if you don't ask, then you're not even beginning the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of critiques of individual approach. One is that they claim that it would be too slow to
Hmm.
get consumers to change, but I don't know how on earth they think legislation is going to be faster. It's everything moves so slowly in government and is so easily overturned and just flimsy, So that makes no sense to me. But you said in I think this was in the article you said that if we reject behavior change as a tool for animal liberation, we end up having to rely on corporations and governments to sort out the problem, and these are the very entities that created the problem. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, which is right, which is a huge problem with the critique of individual effort
Yeah.
is yes, we need major system change. One, what do we do in the short term? And two, how do we effectively put pressure on governments and industry? And three, why do we want to rely on the very entities that cause the problem? We're just supposed
Yeah.
to trust them that they're going to
Right?
sort this out.
Uh yeah, and that kind of streams into something else that I wanted to talk about, talking about shifting the perception of veganism from individual lifestyle choice to an explicit boycott of an unjust system and framing veganism as a justice issue, not just a dietary choice, which I think is a very important part of the individual outreach. And in this article, you wrote, and I have a quote here: indeed, it is the mass movement nature of veganism that causes discomfort. Veganism reminds us that food is political. So, why is it important that we now connect, and as we should have all along, vegan issues to justice issues and to the larger social justice movement?
That's a great question and a pretty complex one. First of all, I would say up front, it is from the outside, I think it's very easy to dismiss veganism because it looks like it's all about consumption and it looks like it's all about consumption of food. So it can look like it's just a lifestyle preference or that it's a form of lifestyle activism. So I think part of the work of the animal rights movement, of the vegan movement, is to really emphasize this idea that it is a boycott of an unjust system and that it is part of the process of building a more just, compassionate, and environmentally sustainable food system. So I will say up front that I think the mainstream animal rights movement has not been terribly good about positioning veganism as a multifaceted social justice issue.
You think?
I was
we're,
wondering, I was like, is it controversial to say that? And I was like, no, I've listened
nah.
to so many of your podcast interviews. I think many
We're
of
get, we're
many
getting
of us,
better
yeah,
though.
yeah,
I don't know if the
absolutely,
mainstream is, but
absolutely.
but as a grassroots, we're getting better. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
And certainly, I think your listenership, you've had so many wonderful authors and thinkers and activists who are on the same page with this. So I think, that the misperception of veganism does sort of come out of partially out of how the mainstream animal rights movement has handled the issue. And I mean that in a few ways. I mean, one is the emphasis on purity and the idea that it's about trying to be the perfect vegan. And that's where I think the environmental movement's critique could be valid, that's where maybe individual action can be a distraction. If it's all about trying to do the individual effort perfectly, so much so that we're not thinking about trying to change the system anymore, that we're not talking about try to change the system and about how we can change the system, then it might in fact be a distraction. And I think particularly if the effort is so much on purity without a continual discussion of the fact that it's a boycott, it's an effort to use our own resources to push the needle and to bring about change. There's also the whole idea of animal rights as a one issue movement, but I think that hasn't really helped position veganism as a social justice movement. And I think if the more we move away from that idea of one issue and the more we recognize that these systems of harm and oppression are interlocking, the better it's going to be to build a healthier, more just food system. Because
Yeah.
the oppression of the workers and food oppression, it's intimately connected. These histories are built upon each other. So it's not only ineffective, it's just historically wrong to argue that animal rights should be a one issue movement.
Yeah.
I mean, as you and your listeners are well aware, there's just this, this history of very sloppy comparisons with human oppression.
Yes.
And comparing human oppression with animal oppression is just not helpful. These are systems of harm that are literally built upon each other, but that doesn't mean the victims are the same. It doesn't mean their experiences are the same.
And what's happening to the animals is horrible enough, and you can describe and relate what's happening to the animals without making those comparisons. It's
Exactly.
unnecessary.
Exactly. I mean, no form of oppression is the same as any other form of oppression.
Yeah.
Um, AFCO has this wonderful, her theorization is really interesting, which is that animal is a category you put someone in when you're willing to harm them.
Mm.
And so her argument is animals are in fact animalized, as are marginalized humans. But because the comparison of human to non-human is a vehicle of harm, to evoke it casually is just always going to generate harm, right? So yes, and what's happening to the animals is bad enough.
Yeah.
So this difficulty connecting veganism to other efforts to build a more just society, it's not just coming from flawed tactics in the animal rights movement. It's coming from outside the movement. And I think it's worth thinking about that because I think it's revealing. And what I mean by that is like, if you recognize that veganism is political, then you recognize that animals are, in a sense, political subjects. They are entities that matter morally, ethically, and also politically. So I think there's a defense mechanism for people who are not vegan, who are not invested in animal ethics, to treat veganism as a lifestyle and as a kind of choice. Like, oh, well, you're vegan. Oh, well, I follow a Mediterranean diet, as if it's just a sort of set of dietary choices. I
Right.
think there's a defense mechanism in there because as soon as you recognize that it's a justice issue, that like I'm a vegan the way I am a feminist, the way I am anti-imperialist, then automatically, if someone can hear that and recognize that, then they begin to recognize the validity of the vegan claim on a
Yeah.
political level.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a responsibility that comes up then,
Right.
right?
Right.
Then, okay, then suddenly I have to be invested in changing this or helping in some way. And where other issues, you don't have to do a whole lot day to day, like maybe sign a petition or whatever. But this issue, we are absolutely fully causing and deep in the problem by eating animals 3 times a day.
Right,
So,
exactly. And other things, yes, it's indirect, right? Like, okay, my tax dollars are going for things that are horrific. And I can and do take action around that, but the action is indirect.
and I can make a
That
post
doesn't
on
go very
Facebook and
right.
I
Yeah.
have done my duty.
Yeah, yeah. And granted, we should all be doing a lot more about all of these issues, but it is different when, as you say, that it's it's more direct.
Yeah, we are part of the problem daily. The choices we make hourly, hour to hour, what we're going to eat the next time we eat. And I get that really, I mean, you really have to look in the mirror, with that one, with this. And I love how you said that, making the animal issue political suddenly makes it like, oh, okay, I'm invested. I have to care and do something about this. I'm responsible.
Or at the very least, what it does is it signals that this is a struggle for a better world
Justice.
to try to
Yeah.
improve our conditions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think this also does come out of the history of vegetarianism. I think that's also interesting to think about, which is that there is a long history of vegetarianism. Whenever there's histories of oppression, there's histories of resistance. And, obviously vegetarianism has existed for thousands of years, but in the absence of large scale corporate farming and like large scale, massive meat consumption, like vegetarianism has been focused on like individual ethics or the religious and spiritual commitments of a community, on a kind of striving, on mental clarity. And that history is so important. And also, it has individualized the decision to abstain from meat or from animal products. And it's kind of reduced it to something that happens only at the level of the individual or the community.
Hmm.
And the situation we're in now is different
Yeah.
historically
Yeah.
than from how animals have been exploited in the past. And what we're up against is so egregious, so organized, it's expansionist.
And so global.
Yes, it's so
It's
global. And these
yeah.
corporations are pushing meat. It's a form of it. This is a whole other issue, but meat consumption and raising animals for slaughter has functioned as part of colonialism for hundreds of years. And now it's kind of become part of this like late capitalist globalized distribution network. And so therefore we need a different kind of resistance. We need a kind of organized resistance, a kind of political movement.
Yeah.
But a lot of the discourses around the abstention from meat like still hold over from that long history, as
Hmm.
things do. Things hold
Yeah.
over from their
Yeah.
histories.
Well, speaking of political movements, I do want to transition into talking about Gandhi. And, I know we've, I feel like I love talking to you about this stuff. We could go on and on. Just so people know, I do have numerous podcast episodes that are focused on social justice and anti oppression and veganism. So if you go to our website, there's a drop down menu of episodes and they're categorized. And there's one that says that is labeled anti oppression. So you can get more information about this. But I do want to transition because I love that you have connected all of this to Gandhi and his satyagraha movement and the Khadi movement. And that is just really interesting to me. So I do want to reserve some time here at the end to talk about that. And I guess we do need to kind of just set it up first. If you can maybe just give a little background for those that aren't familiar with the history and the story of Britain's occupation of India for about 200 years, that ended in about 1947 with the revolution and independence of India. And maybe explain what khadi is and significance in India and in that time of British occupation.
Sure, I'd be glad to. So we tend to talk about colonialism now, like in the United States, in metaphorical terms, like the imposition of cultural norms. Or because of the history of the United States being what it is, we tend to focus on settler colonialism, and that is enormously important in the United States. Settler colonialism is really based economically on land grabbing, on appropriating land from indigenous communities. Whereas metropolitan colonialism is what happened in India and in a number of other places in the British Empire, which is a little bit different because it entailed colonial powers taking over the economic and political systems, but doing so from the center, as in like in terms of British colonialism from the UK. So creating resources, raw resources in the colonies, bringing them back to the center for processing into products, and then selling those products back at a profit. So this is important because colonialism is an oppressive system. It's about domination. And also at its root, it's an economic proposition. And this is going to be important when we talk about the Khadi movement. So the British Empire, as you probably know, there's that phrase of the sun never sets on the British Empire. So it spanned from the Americas, the Caribbean, Europe, Ireland and Scotland, all over the African continent, west, east, and south, Asia, India, and China. But India was referred to as the jewel in the crown because of its potential for wealth generation and also its strategic importance. So the way colonialism worked in India was that cotton was grown in India. It was sent to the UK to be made into garments in the factories, largely in industrial towns like Manchester, and then sold back to the people of India at a profit. So cotton, the cotton industry, is where we can see that idea that we were talking about before, that systems of oppression literally rest upon each other and are literally built upon each other. The cotton industry is a perfect example of this, that colonialism and the exploitation of factory workers and the creation of this exploited working class in Britain were the very same system. So the experience of the victims was not the same, but the system was built on exploiting these two different populations. So another interesting part of this is that the British East India Company was established in 1600, and it was established as a multinational corporation. So we tend to think of globalization, economic globalization, as something that really happened like in the 20th century, but it has a very long history. And it was focused on what they called trade, very unequal trade, but it was about getting products to circulate globally. The initial idea was not to meddle in native politics. And what we think of as like that overt cultural colonialism really didn't happen until the 19th century. So that idea of trying to change the native population, trying to get them to adopt English as a language, as a lingua franca, having an English education system, all of that happened in the 19th century. And then political colonialism really only started after the uprising of 1857. So the important thing here is that like British colonialism had like a 250-year history of being economic before it became political.
Hmm.
And the Indian nationalists knew that. And particularly the Congress Party in the early 20th century, in like the 1920s, 1930s, really recognized that colonialism was all built on this economic exploitation. And they recognized that the people of India were propping up the very system oppressing them by using their resources to buy English products. So this is really interesting in terms of looking at the role of the individual and looking at the role of consumption. Mohandas Gandhi is probably most famous for the Satyagraha movement, otherwise known as nonviolent civil disobedience, but also really central to Satyagraha. It wasn't just a nonviolent civil disobedience movement. That part of it's important, but boycott was very central. It was a key tactic, and it was especially focused on cotton. So the idea was to bring the mills of Manchester to a halt by refusing to buy the cloth woven professionally in the UK. And the campaigns were to get Indian peoples to stop buying that cloth that had been produced in Manchester and in the industrial cities of the UK, and to stop buying the clothes that had been made out of that professionally woven cloth.
Yeah.
So that,
And if
yeah,
I could just
go
say,
ahead. Yeah,
and
yeah.
you said it, but I just want to clarify again for people that might not know. I mean, they're basically charging or dinging the Indian economy twice by first taking the resource of the cotton, taking it to the UK or Britain, making garments out of it, and then selling Indian cotton garments made in Britain back to India. So it was kind of like charging them twice, using their own resource to make a lot of money. It's just,
Yes.
yeah. Okay. Just want to clarify. It's really like, I don't know, crazy.
Yeah, really egregious and
Yeah.
really central to what colonialism is.
Yeah.
Like, that's the fundamental idea of taking the resources from the colony, turning them into something, and selling it back at a profit.
Awful.
Yeah, yeah, just
Yeah.
unbelievably horrible. And also, like, really not metaphorical, right? It's like really material. It was
Yeah.
really about extracting resources and making money off of the colonized
Yeah.
population. And so, I mean, now we see the implications of this, that the European colonial countries have this incredible wealth, and all of these places that they've colonized are still struggling with
Yeah.
poverty. And that just didn't happen incidentally. That happened because of very intentional policies.
Yeah. Yeah. So go on with the boycott. I just wanted to be sure everybody understood that. Yeah.
Yes, yes, very much a central point. So if a population could be convinced to stop buying these products that were exploiting them, it needed to be replaced by something. And what Gandhi and the other Indian nationalists decided to do was to encourage people to produce and buy homespun cotton cloth, which is what khadi is. Khadi is homespun cotton, coarse cotton. The interesting thing is that of course, India had its own practices of creating, turning cotton into garments. But khadi was kind of a dying art. And so it had to be revived, and people had to be taught how to do it. That's actually why the spinning wheel is one of the symbols of India.
Yeah,
Had
and
to,
on
yeah,
the
and
the new Indian independence flag.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right. It's on the flag. Yeah, because people had to learn how to spin cotton. They needed to learn how to do this as individuals and in groups. And it also required widespread adoption. So the Congress Party and Mohandas Gandhi had to go to communities and convince people that this was a good idea and that this was going to work. So give up the finely produced British cotton and start wearing coarse cotton instead. And it required individual people, families, communities to cease buying British cotton. And it also, like now in India, like khadi can sort of be like a fashion statement, and like you can see these really beautiful textiles, and sometimes it's woven like really beautifully, so it's very soft. Um, at the time, it was like this coarse, heavy cotton, and when you think about how beautiful so many of the textiles of India are, to ask people, I mean, to ask people anywhere really to give up beautiful attire and to start wearing these coarse clothes that are in neutral colors, it's a major sacrifice. And particularly in a society that has a history of such um, gorgeous, ornamented clothes.
Bedazzled.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so it's really quite a big sacrifice.
Yeah.
And to convince people to make that sacrifice, to do that on a grassroots level, person to person, community to community, and to convince people that it was going to work, that you're going to bring down the world's largest empire by wearing homespun cotton. I mean, it's amazing that they were able to convince people to do this. And particularly in India, in a society such as India that was so diverse and had massive societal divisions along the lines of caste and class and religion and gender. And there were all these equality movements around all these forms of difference. And yet the nationalist movement and the Khadi movement required all these groups of people to agree to come together on this issue. And the tactic worked. They
Mm.
really did bring the mills of Manchester to a halt. And that did eventually bring down the British Empire. It's
Well,
combined with other factors, the two world wars, the rise of the US as a superpower, but nonetheless, that
mhm.
economic tactic
Yeah. And
worked.
there was also salt too, a boycott of
That's
salt and
right.
the Salt March. So there was a lot of boycott tactics.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how do these economic boycotts, how do they relate, or how are they similar to the vegan movement? And what can we learn from these tactics?
So I was inspired to think about this by Dr. Sailesh Rao of Climate Healers. And he had this very interesting response to mainstream environmentalist claims that you can't get large numbers of people to take voluntary action at once.
Hmm.
This is a common critique of individual outreach and individual actions.
Yeah.
You're not going to get people to take individual action at once. And Dr. Rao's response to that, I'm paraphrasing here, but anyone who thinks that's true has not paid enough attention to India's Khadi movement, because that's exactly what it was. It was convincing people to take individual action all at once. It was grassroots, and it brought down the British Empire. So I heard Dr. Rao say this, and then I got to thinking, okay, that's a really interesting idea, but what are some implications of it? What can we learn from this, like structurally? So just to be clear, In relation to what I said earlier about not making sloppy comparisons, I'm not saying that animal exploitation is the same as colonialism or that the victims of these systems of harm are the same, but it's looking at structural similarities in the movements. And so here are some of the things that I've been thinking about. Veganism, I think, in the current context, appears to be unique as a social movement because it's about what we buy. And so, as we've talked about, it can be easy to dismiss, partially because animals are trivialized, but also because it looks like what people sometimes call lifestyle activism. And as we've also talked about, for people who haven't cut through their cognitive dissonance, they might not even see the economic component. It might not even be apparent that by when we choose what to eat, we're choosing what to buy, whether we've gone to the store and bought that ourselves or whether somebody else has. We make choices that have an economic impact. And so whenever we eat something, we are in effect buying it, even if someone has given it to us for free. So it's easy to look at veganism, and as we've talked about, to miss the boycott element, but it's also easy to look at it and say, oh, well, that's just about what people consume. It's not really that political. But in fact, veganism is not unique because boycotts have a very long history. In fact, the term boycott goes back to the British colonization of Ireland, and a representative of the English, I think, government or military, whose name was Boycott. And the focus was on rejecting and refusing to buy products as a response to that colonial occupation. So
Huh.
boycotts have a very long history, and they have a very long history of being effective, and they are definitely political. So saying veganism is just about what you eat, would be a little bit like saying the Khadi movement was just about your choice of fashion. So in the modern context, that to refuse fast fashion is just about your choice of what to wear. The flaw in that logic is, of course, that the decision to refuse to purchase something is an effort to put economic pressure on a system of oppression. And the systems of oppression, again, are unique, but the tactic can work in different contexts. Another similarity is this intentional sacrifice. I mean, that's one of the forms of resistance to veganism is, oh, you have to give something up. But boycotts, that's what they do. You do have to give something up. And the Khadi movement, it was even more of a sacrifice because Khadi, it had to be revived, and the process of spinning cotton from hand is incredibly labor intensive. Whereas with veganism, traditional diets have historically been plant based. There are plant rich cuisines to draw from. There's so much abundance, and it's far less of a sacrifice than Khadi. I mean, it would be as if veganism required people to grow their food by hand. The perceived expense is another similarity. There's some research now that suggests that plant-based diets are actually less expensive than meat-based diets, but Khadi really was more expensive. In fact, Gandhi talked about that, and he said that the true cost of Khadi is in the revolution of one's tastes. So, which I think is really illuminating for other social movements.
Hmm.
That even if something appears to be more expensive, the goal is to revolutionize one's taste. And I think what he meant by that isn't just adjust to a more humble way of living, which I think that was probably part of it. But the other part of it was to adjust to something that is different and to understand that there's pleasure and enjoyment to be found in that. And I think that's certainly something that we can learn from in the vegan movement.
I could see people maybe saying, well, the Indian population had more of an investment to do this boycott because they were directly affected by British occupation and they, wanted their freedom and their independence. Whereas we're asking people to do something that has to do with something outside of themselves with animals. So it's not as connected or, immediate to their lives. But I think this is where, and I can understand that critique, but I think this is where when we connect social justice to the vegan issue, where we say, no, it is connected to so much. It's connected to the workers. It's connected to food deserts in various locations. It's connected to, the environment and climate change and all of that. So when we make those connections, then suddenly it does become more personal to people to want to make those changes.
Yes. And I think we shouldn't prevaricate around this issue because veganism, animal ethics, these are movements of allies. They are fundamentally different from other justice issues
Yeah.
because animals don't have political power. And
Yeah.
so we can't do what we do in other justice movements, which is amplify the efforts of those who are directly on the line.
Yeah.
And so I think it's okay to acknowledge that. I think in thinking about the Satyagraha movement, it is important to recognize that, yes, people were being directly affected, and this was their self-interest. This was about their self-determination. This was about their dignity. This was about their economic survival. Absolutely. And yet, India is an incredibly diverse, politically complicated, socially complicated society. And the stakeholders had very different stakes in all of this. The post-colonial theorist Gayatri Spivak relays this anecdote about, I think, when she was a child growing up in Bengal. She heard these two women, these two farm workers talking, and one of them said, "Who does this river belong to?" This is under British colonialism. And the other woman said, "Well, it belongs to the company." And the first woman said, "Well, there are people coming around saying it doesn't belong to the company, it does belong to us." And then the second woman said, it'll always belong to the company. It might be a different company, but it will always belong to them. So that kind of shows that there was that reticence around the nationalist movement of people of marginalized castes, marginalized communities, people who are economically struggling to say, why should I throw in my lot with the nationalists when you don't really represent my interests? And what the nationalists did a very good job of is coalition building and saying, yes, we care about economic issues. We care about caste issues. Granted, there was a lot more work, is a lot more work to be done there. We care about feminist issues. Again, more work to be done. But they did make that active attempt to build coalition across different communities with different concerns. And so I think that relates to your point that framing veganism, animal ethics as about the animals, but not only about the animals, and recognizing that human interests are very much at stake. We are facing the existential threat of environmental degradation.
Yeah.
And the animal agriculture industry is a huge part of that. We are facing the threat of zoonotic disease. We just got out of one pandemic, and
Yeah.
now we are seeing the threat of H1N1,
Yeah.
of bird flu. We are seeing the demise of the effectiveness of antibiotics, like one of the major health discoveries, one of the things that allowed people to survive infection, to be able to undergo surgery. So these kinds of things, there is self-interest there, let alone concerns like environmental injustice, the fact that the waste from animal agricultural holdings is being dumped on frontline communities, on impoverished communities, communities of color, the fact that the subsidy system does directly create systems of food oppression,
Yeah.
where what people have access to are animal foods because they're subsidized. The fact that workers are being horribly exploited. Yes, they are being exploited in the fields. And this is where the vegan movement needs to be better about solidarity building, but they are also being undergoing experiencing horrific conditions working in slaughterhouses. So I think that's where the connections need to be built, not just around self-interest, but to build coalition and to act in solidarity is incredibly important because the exploitation of animals, it undergirds all of these other systems of harm.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, Jay, I feel like I could talk to you all day. There are some guests that come on that I just feel like I just want to talk to you all day about this stuff because we have such paralleled views, and also you have such a wealth of knowledge that is exciting, and I feel like everybody needs to hear this stuff. So I'm so grateful to have this podcast to be able to share your thoughts, your brain with everyone.
Thank you. I think it's really interesting how there are such commonalities in the things we've been thinking about, the things we've experienced, and the ways in which we're approaching these issues. I found it really generative to talk to you.
Yeah, wonderful. Wonderful. Well, we do need to wrap up. I feel like I have a feeling this is going to be a long one because I'm not going to want to cut anything. Let's wrap up with the last question. Jay, what gives you hope for the future?
So I am writing a book chapter about hope right now.
Wow.
And yes. And so I am so excited about this question. I've just learned all this stuff about the thinking about hope. So I'm really excited to share it.
That's
Um,
awesome.
and I think it's a great question. I know it overlaps with your name. So, and of course, with the name of the podcast as well. I think it's a really great question. What gives you hope as opposed to what are you optimistic about? Because hope and optimism are different things. Optimism is kind of assuming everything's going to work out. But hope, for the people who've like written about and theorized hope, hope means having a goal. It means like being turned towards something. And it
Hmm.
sometimes includes the idea of having a plan as to how to reach that goal,
Huh.
which I think is super interesting. And so the people who write about hope have these different categories. Critical hope is where like it's actually just by recognizing the problem, you're signaling that things could be different. There's transformative hope, like having an idea of what something better could look like. And then there's radical hope, which is having a plan for getting there.
Mm.
So if we take up that idea that there are these different kinds of hope, then like we can have hope even as we acknowledge the conditions are terrible. And in many ways, they are in terms of animal exploitation, the environment, humans who are facing violence, horrible economic exploitation, whose dignity is being degraded. But critical hope allows us to recognize all of that and then say, but just the fact that I'm recognizing it shows that things could be different. And so I think it might be interesting to actually end where we started with like thinking about like the mainstream environmentalist critique that we need more than individual change, we need fundamental system change, and like recognizing that there's something really wrong with a system that would actually let us destroy our life support, that is the planet. And I think that's important. Like in talking about individual effort, I don't want to undercut the importance of systemic efforts. But the mainstream environmentalist movement, when they say that like we need system change, I don't really get a lot of critical or transformative hope. Like, in other words, like we hear about a critique of our economic system, but like there's this deep sense that something is wrong. And I think veganism, and particularly veganism that's built on social justice, like a sort of human social justice oriented animal ethics, what it shows us is that we have a system built on normative violence. So it's not surprising that we are harming our planet, that we have this ecocidal mindset when we have a whole system built on normative violence. And so recognizing that is a form of critical hope. And figuring out what to do about it can be radical hope. And in terms about what gives me hope personally is that I already see this process happening. Like when I look at how many brilliant minds are working on animal ethics, the writing on animal ethics, particularly the writing that engages with human justice issues, is so intelligent, so thoughtful. The kind of social justice veganism work that's being done now in terms of Black veganism, in terms of workers' rights, organizations like Food Empowerment Project, and things like the Unity Food Bank that are working with vegan food justice. Like, there's people who are such brilliant thinkers and activists who are doing this work. And despite its reputation as an elite practice, a lot of vegan advocacy is actually coming from the margins. It's the rates of veganism in communities of color are higher and they're rising faster than in white communities. We've seen a long history of women being involved in animal ethics and veganism. There's was this really wonderful project, people in Ukraine, people who had themselves experienced war, providing vegan food relief. And they were talking about how well received it was because these were people who had directly experienced violence and they recognized the need to avoid imposing violence on other people. So, right there, all wrapped up in that, we have critical hope, we have transformative hope, and we have radical hope in action.
Hmm. Wow. I love all that. Radical hope. That's me.
Yes, it could be a new moniker.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, but I love that you brought it back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, the individual versus system change. And it's true. I feel that that individual piece, that grassroots piece is hopeful. It's empowering, right? It gives us the hope that there can be a better future when we are able to make change in our own life and have our own actions reflect the ethics that we hold dear. So, yeah, I agree. The individual action is very hopeful.
yes, individual action is a form of imagination.
Mm, nice. Wonderful. Well, Jay, thank you so much for all your work, for all your deep thinking on these important issues, and I am really glad to connect with you, and I hope we can talk more. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I think this is one of those podcasts that really needs to go out far and wide. We need to get this information out to the broader vegan and animal advocacy community. So please share this episode however you can, whether it's on social media. You can go to our Facebook or Instagram pages and share it from there. You can go directly to our website, hopefortheanimalspodcast.org, and share the episode from there. And if you're listening on a podcast app, please scroll down, find the ratings, and give this one a 5-star. That would be awesome. Maybe write a review, letting others know what kind of important topics this podcast digs into. This is such a critical issue, this dichotomy of individual action versus systematic change. And just to be clear, I do feel we need both. I hope that that was clear. And I think Jay would agree with me. We need both. We're not saying that individual change is all we need or the only thing that's going to get us there. No, we need lots of different tools, lots of different campaigns and efforts, but we can't ignore that individual personal change. We have to change who we are, what we care about, what are our personal values. That is so critical to be able to make any kind of external changes. And remember that vegan is a boycott. It is a boycott of a cruel, unsustainable, horrible industry. This industry is unreformable. We can't reform our way out of this problem. These reforms may be steps towards this goal, but we can't lose sight of the end goal of no exploitation of any sentient being on this planet. No commodification, no killing, no exploitation of any animal, any human, anyone on this planet. So we have to have veganism, the political veganism, the ethical veganism in our sights, in our hearts, and as our end goal. Thank you for listening. Please share this episode and live vegan.